There is one secret I have carried for 43 years. One truth so carefully buried that powerful men spent decades searching for it. Innocent people lost their lives simply asking the wrong questions. And I, a woman who took a vow of peace, lived every single day knowing that if the wrong person ever found what I was protecting, the consequences would be devastating. I never asked to become its guardian. I never wanted this burden. But the moment it was placed in my hands, I understood one thing clearly. Some truths are not meant for everyone, and some silences are the bravest decisions a person will ever make. By the end of this story, you will understand why the greatest sacrifice I ever made was not risking my life. It was choosing silence when the entire world was demanding answers. To understand why I became the guardian of a secret I never asked to keep, you have to understand who I was before any of this began. My name is Sister Margaret. I entered the convent of St. Hildegard in rural Pennsylvania when I was 22 years old, not because I was running from anything, but because I genuinely believed that a quiet life of purpose was the most honest life I could offer. I loved history. I loved preservation. I loved the idea that forgotten voices deserve to be remembered. Inside that convent, I spent most of my days working in the archive library, cataloging documents, restoring fragile manuscripts, protecting centuries of recorded human experience. It was peaceful work, meaningful work, and I was absolutely certain that nothing extraordinary would ever find me there. I was wrong. The convent itself was built in 1847. Its stone walls had absorbed generations of prayers, secrets, and silences. There were rooms in that building that hadn't been opened in decades, a sealed vault beneath the east wing, an archive room where the shelves were so crowded with forgotten manuscripts that the dust had formed its own kind of archaeology. I had spent 15 years carefully working through those archives, and I had learned to recognize when something had been deliberately hidden rather than simply forgotten. In the spring of 1981, Sister Dorothea came to find me. She was 84 years old and had lived inside those walls for 60 years. She had never spoken much to anyone, but that morning she held my hand the way people do when they are preparing to leave. She pressed a small iron key into my palm and told me that when she was gone, I would find a wooden box in the sealed room beneath the east wing. She said I should open it carefully, read everything inside, and then decide wisely what to do next. She died 3 days later. I told myself it was probably old correspondence, maybe private letters from a long-deceased abbess. But when I finally opened that box in the dim light of that underground room, I sat completely still for a very long time. Inside were 47 documents, letters, handwritten ledgers, a partially coded map, and a journal filled with entries dating from 1919 to 1944. The handwriting in the journal belonged to a man named Father Edmund Voss. I had never heard his name before, but as I read, I began to understand who he was. A Catholic priest who had worked quietly between two world wars, traveling between Germany, Poland, and the United States, facilitating secret negotiations between religious leaders and government officials who were attempting to broker a ceasefire agreement in the early months of World War II. An agreement that, had it reached the right hands in time, might have redirected the course of one of history's darkest chapters. Let me be careful here because I need to be honest with you. Father Voss was not a political figure. He had no official authority. What he had was access, the kind of access that comes from being trusted by multiple sides simultaneously. And what those documents contained was evidence, not of conspiracy, not of supernatural intervention, but of a quiet, sustained human effort involving a forgotten network of religious communities, displaced families, and ordinary people who had collectively sheltered thousands of Jewish families across a secret corridor running from Warsaw through rural Bavaria and into neutral Switzerland. An effort that had been deliberately erased from the official record after the war, not by enemies, but by the very governments that had benefited from plausible deniability. The families who participated in that network had never received any recognition. Their names were absent from every official historical archive I had ever studied, and Father Voss had documented every single one of them, every name, Every location, every date, every dangerous crossing, every child who survived because of an ordinary person who chose extraordinary courage. I understood immediately why this was dangerous, not because the secret threatened governments, but because acknowledging it officially would have forced a reckoning. Several nations that had publicly claimed neutrality or ignorance during that period would have been proven to have known. Some of those governments were still in power, and the families of people who had risked everything and received nothing, those families were still alive, still waiting, still carrying their own silence. Within 6 weeks of opening that box, I started noticing things. A stranger asking our Mother Superior about archive restoration projects. A letter arriving at the convent addressed to Sister Dorothea 2 months after her death. A researcher from a European university who visited under the pretense of studying medieval liturgical records, but who spent most of his time near the East Wing asking about access to sealed storage areas. I said nothing. I watched everything. I confided in one person, Sister Francis. She was younger than me, sharper than most people gave her credit for, and deeply committed to the idea that history owed something to the forgotten. Together, we began carefully cross-referencing Father Voss's records against publicly available historical documents. Every name he mentioned that we were able to verify independently confirmed the same thing. These people had existed, these families had survived, and the entire network had been methodically removed from the post-war record, replaced with official narratives that conveniently assigned credit to institutions rather than individuals. Then Sister Francis disappeared for 3 days without telling anyone where she was going. When she came back, she was different, quieter. She told me she had visited a historian in Philadelphia who had been researching similar gaps in the post-war record for 20 years. She told me he had said that at least 2 separate private foundations were actively trying to locate and suppress any surviving documentation of that particular network, because several of their founding families had direct historical connections to the governments involved. He had also told her that 2 other researchers who had gotten close to the same evidence had faced serious professional consequences. One had lost her entire academic career. The other had died in a car accident that the local authorities had classified as unremarkable. I did not sleep that night. The impossible choice arrived in the winter of 1982. A documentary filmmaker contacted the convent through what appeared to be a legitimate historical organization. He had partial evidence of the network. He wanted the rest. He told me that going public immediately would finally give those forgotten families the recognition they deserved. And he was right. That part was absolutely right. But he also told me he planned to release everything simultaneously, names, locations, the government connections all at once, without preparation, without reaching the surviving families first, without any protection for the descendants of people whose governments had spent 40 years constructing a different history. I thought about a grandmother somewhere who might learn on a television screen without any warning that her entire family history had been a lie maintained by the country she had spent her life trusting. I thought about how public exposure without preparation could strip those families of the one thing they still had, the ability to choose how they received the truth. I thought about Father Voss, who had spent 25 years carefully protecting each person in that network one at a time, with patience and precision and deep respect for human dignity. And I thought about what he would have done. I turned the filmmaker away. He was furious. He implied that I was complicit in protecting the institutions responsible. That accusation stayed with me for years. Maybe it still does. What I did instead took 8 more years. Sister Francis and I, working through a quiet network of historians, archivists, and one retired diplomat who had known Father Voss personally, began the slow and careful process of locating surviving descendants of every family named in those documents. We reached them privately, individually, with dignity and time to process. We helped 43 families access the documentation they needed to seek formal recognition through legitimate historical channels. We ensured that before anything became public, the people whose story it actually was had the opportunity to decide how it would be told. By 1990, enough of those families had formally submitted their accounts to international historical bodies that the record could no longer be officially ignored. The recognition came slowly, quietly, without a single headline connecting it to a wooden box in a Pennsylvania convent. Most people have never heard this story at all, and for a long time I believed that was exactly right. But I am older now, and I understand something I did not fully understand then. Silence has a cost too. The institutions that erased that network never faced a public reckoning. The suppression itself was never exposed, and there are historians today still working against incomplete records because the full truth was never released all at once. I made the most careful choice I could with what I knew. I stand behind it. But I also carry the weight of what that choice did not do. Father Voss wrote something in the final entry of his journal. He wrote that history is not simply what happened, it is what we decide humanity is ready to carry, and that the burden of deciding that the real burden falls not on the powerful, but on the quiet ones who simply refuse to let the truth be destroyed. I have kept that sentence with me every day since 1981. It does not comfort me completely. I'm not sure it is supposed to. Courage was never meant to be comfortable, it was only ever meant to be necessary. So I want to ask you something before you go. If you had been standing in that underground room holding those 47 documents, knowing that the truth inside could restore dignity to thousands of forgotten people, but also knowing that releasing it carelessly could cause real harm to real families, what would you have done? Would you have released everything immediately? Or would you have chosen the slower, quieter, more painful path? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Because I have spent 43 years wondering whether someone else would have chosen differently. And if you felt that question pulling at you right until the very last word of this story, please share it. Because some stories deserve to travel far beyond the people who first carried them.